So I'm Carla Pestana. I am the director of the Clark Library and of the Center for 17th and 18th Century Studies, and I am also a historian at UCLA. So I am first going to acknowledge that we are on the lands of the Gabrielino Tongva people, and they were the traditional land caretakers of Tongovar, the Los Angeles Basin, and the South Channel Islands. I'd first like to acknowledge Ken Karmiole, a Santa Monica-based antiquarian bookseller who provided a generous endowment to establish this lecture series in 2005. This annual lecture focuses on the book trade in England and Europe during the 17th and 18th centuries and the Clark's growing collection of materials related to the collecting, publishing, and dissemination of books in the early modern period, which makes this series particularly appropriate. We are grateful to you, Ken, for your ongoing support for the Center and Clark and of this important lecture series. Now I'd like to introduce this afternoon's speaker, Dr. David Hunter, Librarian Emeritus at the University of Texas at Austin, who is joining us remotely. Dr. Hunter was music librarian and senior lecturer at UT Austin from 1988 to 2017. After an intensive musical education as a chorister of the Chichester Cathedral, he went on to sing with numerous collegiate and city choirs in Wales, England, Champaign, Illinois, and Austin, Texas. He earned his PhD at the University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign and is the author or editor of several books, including The Lives of George Frideric Handel in 2015, in which he revealed that Handel had investments in the slave-trading Royal African Company. In his lecture today, Dr. Hunter will discuss how finding Handel's signature on several slave transfer slips in the records of the Royal African Company, which are held at the National Archives in Kew in England, led him to investigate the ways in which the profits of the slave trade and the plantation economy made their ways into the music world of London and elsewhere in Britain and its Caribbean and North American colonies. Following the lecture, Dr. Hunter will take questions from the audience, and then I invite you to join us for a reception in the building across the lawn. And now, let's all welcome Dr. David Hunter.
Thank you, Professor Pestana, for that fulsome introduction. Your books have greatly expanded my knowledge of Jamaica and the importance of religion in settler colonialism. I'm very grateful for the invitation from Bronwyn Wilson to present this year's Kenneth Karmiole Lecture, and to Ken for so generously establishing it. It is an honor to follow in the footsteps of such illustrious predecessors and to be the first to present on a musical topic. Music publishing and printing is something of a poor relation in the bibliographical world, so I'm glad to redress the balance. I would have preferred to return to the Clark for this event, but chronic illness has me tethered to Austin. I acknowledge that we are meeting on the indigenous lands of Turtle Island, the ancestral name for what is now called North America. Moreover, I acknowledge all the American Indian and indigenous peoples and communities, including the Comanche, Kickapoo, Libon-Apache, and Tonkawa of what is now called Central Texas, who have been or have become a part of these lands and territories. One more thing, a proud shout out to my colleagues working in the trenches of libraries and archives. Our knowledge, skills, and collections combine to make history manifest. I'm thankful for the assistance of all the folks at the Clark and the Center, particularly those with whom I've worked over the last couple of months. Ikumi Kroko for the exhibit, Mal Meisels for my introduction via Zoom to the Cornwall collection volumes and for photos, and Eric Uralma for logistics. And for the AV setup and zooming, I thank Philip Vlasov of Tencent Production Systems. Because of my condition, I've recorded the lecture with the PowerPoint presentation. So I pass you to my voice and image from last week, and we'll rejoin you live, I hope, for the last slide and the Q&A. The lecture comprises three main parts. A development section, to use a term from music analysis, on the title. Then a section explaining my biobibliographical process in the case of subscribers to the opera and to music publications. And third, the example of a single family, its musical and other bibliographical remains, and a connection with the clerk. I conclude with a story about a single song and its transatlantic travels. My title, while lengthy, is indicative rather than definitive, for reasons that will become clear as I elucidate the unique conjunction and difficulties of the terms. I'll work backwards. Reparative history has been having something of a moment in recent years, which is long overdue. For attendees unfamiliar with the term, reparative history requires at least three sensitivities, which I will illustrate by means of examples from music world. First, the ways in which slavery profits were directed towards musical activity must be uncovered. Second, what the present owes morally and politically to the unrepaired past, in the words of Columbia University anthropologist David Scott, needs to be negotiated. As Scott says, the present is haunted by the past because the material and moral, psychological legacies of past atrocity are especially, because rancorously, palpable. This material legacy includes not only such things as statues and other artworks, but also musical scores and instruments, and the performance in our era of works from the time of slavery. History is indeed palpable, given the continued oppressions of systemic racism, poverty, and exclusion. If the avowed goals of settler colonial European societies across the globe are individual liberty, equality, and fraternité, or property, or the pursuit of happiness, then a reckoning of what is owed is surely required. In music world, we are only starting to have this conversation. And third, to name names, because the spending of slavery profits was not done anonymously. With a few notable exceptions, music historians have long ignored both the economic basis of music's existence and the audience for whom music was created and performed. During the 18th century in London, the actions of a select group of wealthy persons who enjoyed the best that is known and sung in the world, to paraphrase Matthew Arnold, were also responsible for the very worst of human atrocities. Their financial underpinning of the violence, theft of personhood, labor, and reproductive capacity, indeed, the destruction of the life worlds of Native Americans and Africans, has to be acknowledged and, in some way, repaired. Biobibliographical work is an excellent way in which to break down the barriers that have been built by music historians between the financial and the aesthetic aspects of music in performance and life worlds. Plenty of evidence for the actions of individuals survives in bibliographical form, both printed and manuscript, though its diffuseness, both in terms of bibliographical control and geographical dispersion, has precluded systematic studies from being undertaken until relatively recently. The Anglo-American project, the 18th Century Short Title Catalogue, for which I worked in the 1980s, has done so much to increase accessibility. Without ESTC, I probably would never have found the reproduction in 18th century collections online of the sole surviving copy at the Harvard Business School's Baker Library of a pamphlet issued by the Royal African Company in May 1720. This showed that Handel was an investor in that slave trading company. The Legacies of British Slave Ownership project at the University College London, initiated and led by Catherine Hall, has put in the huge effort needed to examine the records of the commission set up by Parliament in 1833 to compensate slave owners on the emancipation of the enslaved in British territories in the Caribbean and Cape Colony, and create a publicly accessible database. Now called Legacies of British Slavery, the project is adding to its data by including ownership details on plantations. The uncovered data is allowing the historical record to be corrected and enhanced, such as entries in sources like the History of Parliament or the Oxford Dictionary of National Biography, which were based on older materials and sensitivities that tended to gloss over such matters, except in the most obvious cases like William Beckford MP, who was twice Mayor of London, and his family. A brief sidebar, as it were. Beckford's nephew, Peter, was also a plantation owner in Jamaica. While on a grand tour in Italy, he engaged in what can only be described as human trafficking, purchasing the 14-year-old Muzio Clementi from his father in Rome. Bringing the musical prodigy back to England, the boy had to teach himself in the rural retreat where Peter and his wife Louisa lived. Only at the end of the 7 years so-called apprenticeship was he allowed to leave. Clementi went on to have a highly successful career as a composer, performer, and entrepreneur, and his works are a regular part of piano instruction to this day. For those of you at the Clark, the exhibit includes one of Clementi's compositions, his Opus 4, comprising sonatas for piano with accompaniment for violin or flute. In the aftermath of so much destruction in Britain and the European continent as a result of World War II, leading music librarians banded together to create the rhythm catalogues of music printed before about 1800 and manuscript scores. These efforts continue to the present day, along with the digital presentation of information. The 18th century and beyond of my title is pertinent in several ways. The long 18th century, as it is known in some circles, saw the rapid growth, sustained misery, and eventual cessation of the British slave trade in 1808. Slavery itself was not prohibited until 25 years later. The period from the re-establishment of the Royal African Company in 1672 to the end of Georgian and Regency periods with Victoria's accession in 1837 provide convenient temporal termini. The 18th century also saw the publishing of music by subscription develop into a well-established genre. Many of the musical practices that continue into our century got their start in London during the 18th, including opera seria, oratorios as secular entertainments, concert series and societies, preferences for older music, and performances by child prodigies and star musicians. The instrumental concerto and symphony, sets of improvisations, sets of exercises for learners, all were firmly established during this time. The keyboards of string keyboard instruments changed in color and material. Key colors were switched from black naturals and white accidentals to white naturals and black accidentals. Stained wood and bone were replaced by ivory and ebony, two slave-related materials from Africa. Both these changes were part and parcel of the racism of the time. By the profits of slavery, I mean not just the profits deriving from the slave trade, but more significantly, the profits to be had from owning the enslaved and the use of their labor to produce not just sugar and its derivatives such as rum, but all the other goods exported from the Caribbean islands to North America and Britain, and from North America to Britain. These goods included other crops such as indigo, coffee, cocoa, rice, a whole variety of woods, some of which was used to build musical instruments, along with the mahogany furniture that was so popular. Profits accrued to makers of instruments who used the ivory and ebony traded for alongside the enslaved, who not only were sold at the coast to ship's captains, but also had to carry the elephant tusks and wood from the interior. The persons who ran the financial, insurance, and legal businesses that aided and abetted the slave trade, plantation ownership, mortgaging, and loan making, must also be considered. As awareness has increased in Britain over the last 30 years or so about the sources of funds used to construct country mansions and so on, it has become clear just how integrated the use of the profits of slavery was into the British economy. Music was no different and has to be scrutinized accordingly. London's elite music scene is a locution in that I'm addressing the musical activities of a social elite, the creme de la creme of the top 1%, whose participation in particular activities signaled their eliteness. Furthermore, while much of that musical activity did indeed take place in London, it also went on elsewhere, not just in the spa towns such as Bath, or the county towns with courts and cathedrals such as York, or the newly emerging trade centres such as Bristol. The elite had children who needed educating in music. They wanted to impress visitors through hosting musicians and performances, or improve church musical practices through purchasing organs and paying organists and choir masters. All this activity took place well away from London, but it could not have happened without London as the hub of musical life, instrument manufacturing, publishing, and connectivity. Funding is, in many ways, the most difficult term to define. Not only have most family accounts been thrown away, even if they do survive, they typically only provide details of the expenditure side of a family's finances. Plantation owners resident in Britain are clearly included, as long as they derived all or most of their apparent income from their plantation holdings. But some owners began with or added to their landholding estates in Britain. Is the ratio of domestic to slave-related income relevant? Other owners were such in name only, their estates having been mortgaged. Are the mortgage holders the ones who should be considered as funded by slavery? Occasionally, a property owner may get into such debt to the government that they were awarded a governorship with salary and the lands made over to the government. This happened to the music-loving Sir William Young. Does that make the government slaveholders? Does the size of the holding and therefore its income-generating capacity matter? Surely it does, inasmuch as the ownership of a small number of slaves is never going to generate the income sufficient to enjoy the musical activities I've mentioned. On the other hand, I have found evidence that musicians in Jamaica and other colonies owned a few enslaved persons. Likewise, my study includes musicians in Britain who appear to have worked for slave-owning persons, even though the remuneration they received for such services was in all likelihood a small part of their total income. Names include J.C. Bach, his concert-promoting partner Carl Abel, and the castrato Gasparo Pacchierotti, who was befriended by William Beckford Jr. Given the use of ivory and ebony from Africa and woods from the Caribbean in musical instruments such as spinets, harpsichords, flutes, oboes, and the violin family, and that some buyers of instruments were using slave economy money, makers are on my list of persons who benefit. And we must not forget the music printers, publishers, and sellers, whose wares became part of collections thanks to slavery's profits. The evidence for opera season subscribers exists as pamphlets, books, and fans, the latter an admittedly unusual form of publication. For most years during the period 1783 to 1808, a pamphlet or volume was issued annually, listing the box and seat holders. Only single copies of the volumes are known for 1798 and 1802. 1805 has the most survivors, 8 copies. They are of a size and format that would fit in the capacious pockets of the day or the reticules then coming into fashion. The books are arranged by the levels of the boxes, starting at the bottom, pit level. Each section is preceded by an engraved plan that indicates the number of every box. Shown here, the letterpress listing of pit box 20, occupied by the Lewis and Ricketts families. The first list, published, dated 1783, was unofficial, as is clear from the author's statement, by a lady of fashion, rather than a named person attached to the opera company. William Lee, who kept the refreshment room at the Opera House, ultimately became responsible for the official list. The fans, which could be purchased at shops in Pall Mall, adjacent to the theatre and elsewhere, allowed attendees to more discreetly identify who was present and could be far more decorative and personalized. These are even rarer than the books and entirely lack bibliographical control. As far as I've been able to ascertain, no fans exist for 5 of the years and only single ones for most other years. Where no book or pamphlet exists, I've used information from the fan for that year. There can be minor differences between the books and the fans in terms of names. The fans are printed from engraved plates. In addition to taking a book or fan, opera goers could purchase a bilingual libretto, such as the one for Sarti's Le Geliosi Villana, put on in 1784, which is in the exhibit. Short versions of the subscriber lists were sometimes bound in with these libretti. I'll be the first to admit that prosopographical research is not for the faint of heart. Thousands of names must be checked and large amounts of data compiled. Dates of birth and death, often not readily available or in conflict depending on the source. Residences or places of work, occupations, siblings and children, participation in governance, business or land ownership, religious affiliation, and for the nobility, their titles and ranks, which can change during their lifetimes and are frequently a courtesy. Forenames were frequently recycled for several generations, so without dates, it becomes impossible to tell individuals apart. Often subscribers are only identified by the generic Mr., Mrs., Miss, and last name, which makes identification uncertain at best, particularly for women, as demographic data for them is more often absent or conflicting. The presence of town of residence or business in a subscription list is not necessarily a guarantee for making unambiguous identifications, as siblings or cousins that are eponymous may be involved. Additional wrinkles are provided by the misspelling of names in subscription lists, or the confusion of fore and surnames, or the existence of legitimate variant spellings. Ownership of plantations in the Caribbean or North America is not always easy to ascertain, nor the dates of the transfer of ownership within families, between families, as a result of marriage, for example, or into or out of mortgage. Likewise, the dates of purchase or transfer of estates in Britain, using profits from slave trading or plantations are not always clear. Initial identification involves checking titled individuals in the standard reference sources. All the men, except senior noblemen, are checked in the History of Parliament online for possible election as members of the House of Commons. To assess participation in the slave economy, the first stop is Legacies of British Slavery, and then, if investment in slave voyages is suspected, the slavevoyages.org database. While the majority of cases can be solved quickly, a residue of tough nuts remains. These require the use of a variety of specialized sources for biographical data. In some cases, archival catalogues such as Discovery, the National Archives of the UK, provide useful clues. Establishing accurate dates of birth, marriage, and death is essential, but in some cases, the impediments are great and not helped by amateur or religiously motivated genealogical research. While all sources retain the possibility of error, some are more error-prone or deliberately obfuscatory than others. Sources of dowries can be particularly elusive, and sales of plantations are often hard to confirm. I designate as profiteers only persons for whom clear evidence can be found, so the numbers are likely to be undercounted. This table summarizes the findings about subscribers in terms of certainty of identification and their participation in the slave economy, and covers 3 seasons at the Opera House. 356 persons are named in the 1783 list. Of these, 43 persons are identified only by their surname, with no helpful appellations such as Gen or On. Nonetheless, only 12 of those cannot be associated with an actual person, or there are several options, making a single determination impossible. These dozen comprise both men and women, for though women have traditionally been harder to trace in biographical sources due to male primogeniture and other forms of neglect or disregard, males with common names such as Davis, Hamilton, and Palmer offer too many possibilities. Slave economy profiteers are thought to have struggled financially during the American Revolutionary War, when dearth and destruction and the interruption of trade were widespread in the Caribbean. Some were able to ride out the difficulties and purchase an opera box subscription. 14 years later, in 1797, the next column, a greater percentage, 17%, were drawn from a significantly larger pool of subscribers. Whether the slight decline in subscribers and the slave economy proportion 10 years later, in 1807, is part of a trend or just annual variation remains to be established. Regardless of the proximate causes for attendance, the data indicate that during the 1790s and 1800s, 1 in 6 persons who subscribed was funded from slavery's profits. One example of opera-goers funded in part by slavery moneys is the Lewis family. Father Matthew Lewis had been chief clerk at the War Office since 1772 and was deputy secretary at war since 1775. He married in 1773 Frances Maria Sewell. After the birth of 4 children, Lewis obtained a judicial separation following Mrs. Lewis's affair with the singer Samuel Harrison, who was a leading tenor and performed at the Handel commemoration in 1784 and at the concerts of ancient music. The clerk has a set of programs for these concerts from the 1780s, and there are 2 volumes included in the exhibit. Lewis's career provided a large income due to the fees to which he was entitled at the War Office, which increased considerably during wartime. He also owned 2 plantations in Jamaica. Through his father's connections, son Matthew Gregory Lewis served 1794 to 5 as an attaché at the British Embassy in The Hague, but was withdrawn due to ongoing hostilities with the French. In his 21st year, 1796, Matt, as he was known in the family, had his first novel, The Monk, a romance, published anonymously, and then in a new edition with his name on it. And there are a couple of different editions, including a French translation, in the exhibit. In May, he ran successfully for Parliament. His two sisters, Frances Maria and Sophia Elizabeth, were regular attendees at society balls and concerts. Given that the Opera House box, pit level 20, was held for the 6 seasons that coincided with Matt's time in Parliament, I imagined that father had, at least initially, obtained it as a reward for his son and to support his ambition as a theatrical writer and legislator, in addition to providing a spot in the most elite of entertainment venues for his daughters to appear in public. The evidence points to additional motivations. The subscriber list, published in 1797, names Mrs. Lewis as the holder of the box. In fact, she's very unlikely to have been the responsible party, as she was subject to a purdah enforced by her family. Rather, it was the two daughters, the Mrs. Lewis, who signed up for all 6 seats, presumably paying with their father's money, directly or indirectly. In the following season, the occupants of the box are fully listed and comprised, in addition to Matt, Monk Lewis, his sisters and their father, Governor Poyntz Ricketts and his wife Sophia. The governor was an old friend of Father Lewis, both having been born in Jamaica. The Ricketts property in Jamaica had, supposedly, suffered greatly in the earthquake and hurricane of 1779. While the Ricketts were widely known in elite circles in London, they had signed as witnesses when David Garrick made his will, for example, their income had been much reduced. The king approved Ricketts' appointment as governor of Tobago in 1793 and then to Barbados in 1794. Whether it was Mrs. Lewis or the governor who paid for the seats is unclear, but the Ricketts remained the Lewis's boxmates even after the governor died in 1800, their daughter Isabella taking over her father's seat for 2 seasons. According to biographers of his son, upon retirement in 1803, Matthew Lewis transmogrified a long-standing relationship with Mrs. Ricketts into something that went beyond the bounds of propriety. The opera box proved to be one of the sticking points. The young women refused to sit with Mrs. Ricketts, and attendance was divided into alternate weeks. Subsequently, Matt Lewis wrote to his mother that Sophia is rather in the dumps at her sisters not having yet succeeded in getting an opera box, and that seems to have been the end of their regular attendance. The exhibit also includes Lewis's self-justificatory account of slaveholding, Journal of a West Indian Proprietor, that was published posthumously in 1834. As there are possibly 80,000 different persons and organizations listed in the data set of subscribers to 18th century music publications in Britain and Ireland, it was never going to be possible for me alone to check them all. For my chapter in Music by Subscription, I worked from what I already knew, using name prompts from the lists documenting King's Theatre Opera subscribers and numerous other sources. Having checked approximately 2,500 names, approximate because of overlap between sources, I found 504 persons who, with a reasonable degree of certainty, can be shown to have participated in the slave economy in a direct manner and to have subscribed to music publications. In addition, 30 persons were identified who did not subscribe themselves, but were the source of funds for family members who did. One of the most challenging aspects of prosopographical research is tracking down the identities of individuals not otherwise known to history. For many of the persons resident in North America and the Caribbean, included in the sample of music subscribers, details of their dates, occupations, spouses, property, and so forth can only be ascertained through visits to local or regional archives and libraries. While it is of some interest to know that persons overseas subscribe to publications issued in Great Britain, it would be far more useful to know who they were and try to determine whether they participated in music making activities where they lived. On the other hand, numerous members of the Tuesday Club of Annapolis, Maryland, engaged in music making before the Revolution, but few of them seem to have subscribed to music publications. Several of them owned large plantations and had many enslaved Africans. Two families united in matrimony in 1771 also bring together many of the elements I've mentioned. One branch has a direct connection with Handel. Several items from the families are now in the UCLA collections at the Clark and the Young Research Library, and it is a delight to bring them to everyone's attention. George Amyand was the family member with the closest connection with Handel. In 1756, he was nominated the London co-executor of Handel's estate in the first codicil of his will. Presumably, Amyand's banking and trade businesses made him a suitable choice, though there may have been additional reasons. Elected MP for Barnstable in 1754, Amyand showed his willingness to support the borough 2 years later by paying for the installation of an organ, still in place, in St. Mary and St. Peter's Church, that was altered in 1764 by John Crang. Amyand received a baronetcy in 1764 for assisting the government with loans for war. He purchased a relatively small sugar estate, La Taste, in Grenada in 1765, which expanded to over 200 acres by the 1780s, and on which about 150 enslaved persons labored. George Amyand, in about 1746, married Anna Maria, the daughter and only surviving child of John Abraham Corton and his wife, Anna Maria. Corton was also a merchant of Mincing Lane in the City of London and specialized in trade with Hamburg, the independent port city where Handel had played in the opera orchestra and taught from 1703 to 1705. Among the expenses in Corton's personal account book for 1740 to 46 are the purchase of a double manual harpsichord, a chamber organ, and lessons, presumably for his daughter, from one of the Vincent family. George and Anna Maria Amyand had 2 sons and 2 daughters. George Jr., the elder son and heir, succeeded as second baronet upon his father's death in 1766. In 1771, he married Catherine, the heiress of the Cornwall estates in Herefordshire, centred on Moccas. Their elder son, George, the third baronet, received £3,825, 10 shillings and sixpence, worth about £22.3 million in 2023 pounds as a share of GDP, as compensation for 139 slaves on his estate of La Taste. Lack of archival evidence prevents us from assessing the musical activities of the Cornwall family during the time of Catherine's father Velters, except that he was a subscriber to Felton's 6 concertos, Opus 2, in 1747. For Catherine and her children, it is a far different story. Not only did the family retain the copy of Handel's will, they also amassed a collection of about 3,000 items of sacred and secular printed and manuscript music by 1796, We know this thanks to the survival of an extensive catalogue compiled by one of the daughters. This precious volume was donated to the Bodleian Library, Oxford, by the rare book and music dealer Albie Rosenthal in 1981. A large collection of printed scores belonging to Anna Maria Cornwall and Charles Cornwall is now in the Royal College of Music, London, and a few manuscripts and printed scores are at the British Library, London. One volume of the catalogue music is here at the Clark, and it carries the felicitous identification code of U2. The Cornwall catalogue is, in effect, an index to over 50 composite volumes. This opening shows the references to works by Pergolesi and Stefani that are in U2. Elsewhere, sonatas, quartets and symphonies by Mozart, Haydn and Beethoven are listed in the section somewhat misleadingly titled A Catalogue of All the Harpsichord and Organ Music, along with their contemporaries Clementi, Kramer Jr., Schobert, Storace and Schroeter. In the vocal section, the composers are primarily the opera luminaries of the day, such as Ascioli, J.C. Bach, Paisiello, Piccini, and Rauzzini. On several of the catalogue's pages and on the index to Volume 2 can be found the name Miss Cornwall, which is not as helpful as it might be due to the existence of 3 daughters of Sir George and Lady Catherine who might qualify. The obvious candidate is the eldest, Catherine Frances, aged 22 or 23, who married in 1796 and thereby left the parental home and presumably the music collection. Second daughter, Anna Maria, would have been 15 or 16 in the years mentioned, so it's possible she created it, particularly as her name is on many of the scores that eventually ended up at the Royal College of Music. She never married and was known as a keyboardist at house concerts. Third daughter, Frances Elizabeth, would have been only 12 or 13, so she seems an unlikely candidate, though John Eller described her as the best amateur musician I've ever known, and she presumably made use of the collection and its catalogue. With further research, it may be possible to discern the sequence of dispersals of the music collection from Moccas. A large one happened during the 19th century when John Eller received much. He gave his collection to the College of Organists, and the items were stamped indicating its ownership, including the U2 volume. That organization sold off much of the Eller materials in the 1960s, and U2 found its way to Kenneth Mummery, the notable music dealer in Bournemouth, who sold it to the Clark in 1970. And this volume is in the exhibit. And you can see that U2 reveals itself to be a typical volume in the sense that it is composite, comprising the Walsh edition of Pergolesi's Stabat Mater, 1749, and 3 publications issued by the lawyer turned music publisher Benjamin Goodison, 6 anthems by Henry Purcell, 3 duets by Stefani, and a duet by Giuseppe Sarti, all put out between 1787 and 1790. Only the Walsh publication carries its original decorative title page. Other materials remained at Moccas until Sir Geoffrey Cornwall, 6th Baronet, ordered much of the household furniture, artworks, etc. to be auctioned, along with music scores and instruments, in July of 1946. As is too often the case with country auctions, the music, except for 2 items, went unspecified. Thus, lots 299 to 320 comprise, quote, a large assortment of oratorios, anthems, string and vocal music, manuscripts, etc. That is, there were 22 lots, each one of which may have included 1 or more volumes, as well as single sheet and other loose items. In addition to creating a vast collection of mostly contemporary music, the Cornwalls attended the opera, the concerts of ancient music, and other concert series. They also subscribed to 5 music publications and had 3 dedicated to them. Account books, now at the Herefordshire Archives Service, show that they were regular attendees at the concerts put on by Antonin Camel in the 1770s. During 1787, Lady Cornwall specifies the attendance of herself and Kitty, that is to say Catherine, who was 14 years old, at the concerts for ancient music. Under the heading Kitty for 1791 can be found payments for the ancient concert and the Friday concert. Also in the exhibit is Catherine Cornwall's Commonplace book, which is held at the YRL, although it is wrongly ascribed to Harriet Mary Amyand, who signed and dated it January the 5th, 1772. Harriet Mary was Catherine's sister-in-law, but only 10 when she signed the book. The volume contains riddles and poetry, including some by the Reverend William Cox, a Handel biographer. It was compiled between 1766 and 1788, and many of the verses refer to Lady Cornwall's older daughters. All in all, the Cornwall family's catalogue of music and the identification of more surviving volumes and single sheets would make an excellent PhD. Lastly, I've included in the exhibit The Enchanted Plants of 1800 by Maria Henrietta Heywood. Her father, in his will, gave her and her 3 sisters £8,000 each, which in 2023 was worth almost £79 million as a share of GDP. Money derived in part from the sale of the Heywood plantation in 1796. She had married in 1786 Louis Montelieu, a bank director at Hammersley's, which for a period was the bank used by George, Prince of Wales. After the birth of her children, she turned translator and writer, becoming well known for 2 volumes of verses published and reissued 1800 to 1822, in which she uses plants as moral guides. She and 2 of her 3 sisters were regulars at the opera. To conclude, biobibliographical research has enabled us to explore the 3 sensitivities called for by reparative history in the context of the use. A single sheet publication of a song links first families on both sides of the Atlantic, slavery, music, and popular culture. At the end of the Masque Alfred, put on in August 1740 to the delight of the family of Frideric, Prince of Wales, was heard for the first time an ode, When Britain First at Heaven's Command, more commonly known today by the opening words of the chorus, Rule Britannia. The words were by the poet and playwright James Thomson and the Prince's secretary David Mallet, and the music by Thomas Arne. The occasion, daughter Augusta's 3rd birthday, provided the opportunity for the creators and audience to celebrate Admiral Vernon's unexpected naval victory at Portobello in the Caribbean, and thereby register some political opposition to the current regime of Sir Robert Walpole, the Prime Minister. The Clark Library's copy, and those similar to it elsewhere, have been assigned a date of about 1755. As is typical in music bibliography, such sheets being undated, and a great deal of effort required to ascertain even this approximation. The work still had some currency then, as a marker of patriot opposition to King George II. Numerous composers have quoted the tune, written variations on it, and made other adaptations, including Handel, Beethoven, Wagner, Johann Strauss the Elder, Arthur Sullivan, and Sir Henry Wood. Indeed, it was Sir Henry's inclusion of the piece as part of his Fantasia on British sea songs, written in 1905, and included in his promenade concerts that ensured its popularity through the 20th century. As the concluding part of The Last Night of the Proms, the BBC still finds that concert to be sufficiently engaging to broadcast on television. Over the last few years, the words of the chorus have become notorious. Rule Britannia, Britannia rule the waves, Britons never, never, never shall be slaves. The difficulties have been pointed to by literary scholars, performers, and broadcasters, as well as civil and minority rights organizations. That there has been a conservative, racially based backlash is also clear. Another copy of possibly the same printing is bound with many other single sheet items in a volume that belonged to the Wales family of Virginia. John Wales was born in Lancaster, England, became a colonial plantation and slave owner, and was a slave trader. He was married 3 times and had a childbearing relationship with Betty Hemmings, one of his enslaved. In 1772, Thomas Jefferson married Wales's daughter, Martha. He had a long-term relationship with Sally Hemmings, fathered by his father-in-law. That volume of music came to the Jeffersons along with a portion of the Wales estate, including the enslaved. Whether Rule Britannia was performed at Monticello before the author of the Declaration of Independence drafted that document cannot be established at present, but the sentiment that is expressed in the verses and chorus, that the country's white population should never be subject to foreign or domestic domination, tyranny, is one that the American rebels would soon take up. Jefferson is also known to us as the first Secretary of State for the United States, the second Vice President, and the third President, in which post he served 2 terms. Once military hostilities and diplomacy were concluded, Jefferson visited London and began the purchase in 1786 of a 2-manual harpsichord with a mahogany lid from Jacob Kirkman, the leading maker, for his daughter Martha. He had the assistance of Dr. Charles Burney, the music historian, who was the father of Francis, the novelist, and keeper of the robes to Queen Charlotte, the wife of Frideric's son, King George III, a monarch much reviled in certain quarters, but one who was highly partial to Handel's music. Money from governments, private sources, and slavery enabled the first families and their music providers to enjoy the highest standard of living, while the enslaved were denied even their humanity. Copies of Rule Britannia help us see the interconnectedness of the British monarchy, the American Revolution and presidency, the slavery on which both countries were then dependent, and the hypocrisy of ideology in practice. That some folks should object to it on that basis is not just understandable, but reasonable given the continuing racial prejudice, poverty, and shorter lifespans, to mention but 3 issues, of people of color. Notwithstanding the fact that white citizens have benefited in material and so many other ways from what we now call a crime against humanity, both countries continue officially to refuse consideration of monetary reparation. What forms and actions reparation might take in music world are well worth discussing, along with the pedagogy of music education, repertoire, and the validity of philosophical arguments over aesthetic separation, but on another occasion. Thank you.
Thank you. That was really interesting. We now have a chance for questions. I understand that he can hear us if we speak in the mic. So if you would like to raise your hand, I will run over to you and give you the mic, and then you can say your question. But otherwise, you're just talking to the room and not to the speaker. So.
Hello, I just have a question. What year was it that ebony and ivory became the main material that was used in, I'm assuming, the making of pianos, what harpsichords or whatever?
That's a good question. I have a piece that's due to be published next year on this question as it relates to harpsichords and spinets in England. It appears that the turn to using ivory and ebony was about 1715. So the very beginning of the Georgian era. The situation in England is rather complicated due to the fact that the maker who seems to have first used these materials developed accidental keys that are known for their design feature and called skunk tail, which is to say that they have a sandwich of black, white, black, or white, black, white. This is a very distinctively English feature of harpsichords and spinet keyboards for about 25 to 30 years. And then it was dropped, presumably because, well, I think one reason is because a major maker took over and just preferred to have black accidentals. There is a very interesting question about when keyboard color schemes changed in different countries and different makers. But you're going to have to wait for a future publication from me to find out about that.
Thank you for your superb lecture. Is it known how long Handel remained a shareholder in the Royal African Company?
That's another very good question. It does seem that the periods coincided with payments made by the Duke of Chandos, and therefore the length was fairly short. It's unclear as to whether these were just, as it were, like a pass-through or something more significant than that. But in the summer of 1720, he did not hold onto them for long. There's another set later in the 1720s. Perhaps it's not so much that he had an, as it were, active interest in investing in that company, but he was regarded as an investor by the company because he had stock in it. Later on, and in fact, even before this, in about 1715, he did invest himself in the South Sea Company, which was also a slave trading company, and he had much longer dealings with them right through the 1730s.
Thank you very much for your talk Really enjoyed it. My name is Nina Schneider. I'm the Rare Books librarian here, and I actually have a question about the sheet you showed in your presentation of the Rule Britannia. It looks, you mentioned that it was a single sheet, and I may have actually cataloged it, and I'd have to go back and look at the record. But from the photograph, it looks like it came off of a volume, like maybe it was disbound from something. And
Yes.
I'm wondering, like, how often you've seen single sheets versus sheets that have been bound in volumes.
Oh, quite often. In fact, I began my own list of single sheet items that are listed in the British Union Catalogue of Early Music when I was a neophyte music bibliographer in 1981. That card index I've long since donated to a library in the UK. And in some ways, I wish I hadn't. But on the other hand, I wasn't using that much, having been, as it were, diverted into this whole question of the use of the profits of slavery to support musical activity. Indeed, many of those bound volumes have been disbound and the items sold separately. Obviously, it's in dealers' commercial interest to do that. And that's why the survival of U2 at UCLA is such an important thing. You know, we have the whole volume and that index that was made at the time by the owners. I think it's just a wonderful survival.
May I ask a question? This is Carla Pestana.
Sure.
I have so many. I have talked to Catherine Hall about the reception in Britain of the Legacies project.
Yes.
And I wonder if you could say a little bit about how your own work showing these connections between slavery and profits from slavery and the musical world has been received. Have people been upset to learn this? Have they, I don't know, can you talk a little bit about the response that you've gotten?
Yes, I would say some people have indeed been upset, not just in Britain, but also in the US. Of course, Ellen Harris responded to one of my pieces. She is emeritus from MIT as a professor of music and as a Handel scholar, and she was very upset by what I had to say. But there are other people who don't care to engage with me anymore. In fact, one scholar came up to me after a conference and said, "Another one of your blooming papers, Hunter," which I took both as a compliment but also as indicative of the difficulties that some people have with trying to come to terms with this issue. The art historians, the architecture people, the landscape people, you know, institutions like the National Trust and the Church of England and universities in the UK and over here are all grappling with this as best they can and trying to understand what it means for us today to know about these things and to be attentive to them. One of the people who I'm in touch with is Corinne Fowler, who has had a lot of opprobrium directed to her, quite abusive emails and so on. largely because she has been in the public eye far more than I have. But there are places that are interested in hearing from me, and one of those has been the Royal Opera House, Covent Garden, who are making great strides to try and understand the legacy of the funding of that institution.
Yes, I was wondering if you think the influence of the slave prophets on music was somehow qualitatively different from the influence on other cultural, areas.
Well, would you care to define qualitative?
Well, I guess I'm thinking, rich people supported music and they got their money from slavery. Was that also true in drama and art? And
Yes, yes. That portrait that I showed of the Young family, that painting was by a very well-known painter who was patronized by the royal family, Zoffany, and he is a leading figure in the portrait painting of the middle of the 18th century, and his patrons included other people who were had their incomes largely from the plantation ownership. But he has, as it were, yet to be exposed. But I'm sure there's an art historian somewhere who would be interested in doing that.
Other questions?
Yes, I'm Myra Hilberg. We're at the Clark Library, and I'm just sitting here thinking, the arts have always been supported by the wealthy. We wouldn't have the Los Angeles Philharmonic without, Clark Jr. No. How they get their money, I don't think it's always a particularly moral thing. The Clarks completely raped the state of Montana and exploited their workers, but we got this beautiful library, and I don't know. It's sort of like, if you go back in history, as you certainly have, and I certainly appreciated this whole perspective, I'm just thinking, would we have expected them to be moral investors? Do we expect people today to be moral investors?
Well, those are very good points. I would say there's a lot of difficulty in Britain, at least, and some over here, about oil companies funding art exhibits or museum exhibits or galleries or what have you. So I think there are people who are concerned today about, and the Royal Opera Company come to that. They do find investment by petroleum companies to be problematical. And of course, George Bernard Shaw, wrote about the arms manufacturing and manufacturer Major Barbara, and yes, these concerns do go back and come forward to today. Yes, I mean, it's possible that I'm being hypocritical in as much as I have some retirement funds that are invested in who knows what. But unfortunately, I don't have much control over those. The issue of, whether investment company managers who have scads of money today and the havoc that they can wreak, that is certainly problematical. I do think the dependence in the US on private money compared to Britain and Europe, where it's a little bit different because you have some more state support. Does make institutions over here, more ready to accept funds than they perhaps might be. Does that answer your question?
Well, I think the dependence on private donation that you're referring to in the United States is one that we're very aware of. And also, I think that the Clark has really benefited from. So I'm a little bit ambivalent about whether or not we want to.
Sure.
I mean, it would be great if the state would pay for the
Yes.
things that UCLA does.
Right.
But I'm really grateful that we have all these supporters who
Sure.
do bring us the benefit of their largesse. Maybe there's a distinction here about philanthropy versus just hanging on
Yes.
to their money.
I do think that is an important distinction. Yeah, I mean, a lot of these famous libraries, like the Pierpont Morgan or the Huntington, heck, they yes, they wouldn't exist without the largesse of capitalist profiteers.
Right, exactly. So there's an interesting thought to end on, maybe. I want to thank you so much for this. It was really interesting and quite impressive research and interesting documents. I didn't know you could find out Opera Box subscribers from the 18th.
Yes.
I'm sorry that you won't be here to join us for the reception, but I hope everyone in the audience will make their way over across the lawn to, so that we can have a reception and a chance to talk about what we just learned. So thank you so much, David. I really appreciate it.
And thank you. I've really enjoyed and appreciate the opportunity.